In 1991, a car company from Hiroshima showed up to the biggest endurance race on the planet with an engine that every other manufacturer had abandoned decades earlier. They were slower than Mercedes. They were slower than Jaguar. They qualified 19th, and they won. By 2 laps. This is how. To understand what Mazda pulled off at Le Mans, you need to understand the world they were walking into. Not just the race, the entire competitive landscape that had been building for years. The 24 Hours of Le Mans is the oldest active endurance race in the world. It has been running since 1923 on the Circuit de la Sarthe, a 13.6-kilometer loop of French countryside made up of public roads that get closed off once a year so that prototype racing cars can scream around them for an entire day and night. The circuit includes the Mulsanne Straight, a stretch of road where cars routinely exceed 320 kilometers per hour before standing on the brakes for a tight right-hander. Then there are the Porsche curves, a sequence of fast-flowing bends that punish any car with inconsistent aerodynamic balance. It rewards one thing above all else: survival. You can be the fastest car on the grid by a mile, but if your engine gives up at hour 18, it means exactly nothing. Speed gets you on the podium at Monaco. Reliability gets you on the podium at Le Mans. Every car that finishes this race has earned it. By the late 1980s, the race was dominated by European money and European engineering aristocracy. Sauber-Mercedes had a 5-liter twin-turbo V8 that produced over 720 horsepower in race trim and 850 when the boost was turned up for qualifying. Their chassis was full carbon fiber, designed from scratch by a man named Leo Ress, and the whole package had dominated the World Sports Car Championship for 2 straight years. Jaguar had a massive 7-liter V12 and Tom Walkinshaw's relentless preparation. They had won Le Mans in 1988 and again in 1990. Porsche had owned the race outright for most of the decade before that, winning every single year from 1981 through 1987. 7 straight victories. These were the giants. Behind them, Japanese manufacturers like Toyota and Nissan had been throwing serious money and engineering resources at Le Mans for years. Neither had won, not once. Toyota had come close, Nissan had been fast. But the French circuit had a way of humbling everyone equally. And then there was Mazda, a company roughly 1/10 the size of Toyota, a company that had staked its entire motorsport identity on a type of engine that the rest of the automotive world had evaluated, experimented with, and collectively decided wasn't worth the trouble. The Wankel rotary engine, no pistons, no valves, no camshafts, no connecting rods. Just triangular rotors spinning inside a pitrocoid-shaped housings, creating 3 combustion chambers per rotor as they rotate. Compact, remarkably light for the power it produces. Capable of spinning to RPM levels that would shake a piston engine apart, and doing it with a smoothness that conventional engines simply cannot match. Also historically unreliable, desperately thirsty for fuel, and notorious for eating through its own internal seals the way termites eat through wood. The rotary engine was the brainchild of Felix Wankel, a German inventor who patented the concept back in 1929 and spent the next 3 decades trying to make it work. NSU, the German manufacturer, licensed the design and produced the first rotary-powered production car in the 1960s. Other companies tried it. Citroën tried it. General Motors experimented with it. Mercedes studied it. One by one, they all walked away. Too complex, too thirsty, too fragile. Mazda was the only company on the planet that refused to give up. Here is the specific problem Mazda faced going into 1991. The governing body of world motorsport, FISA, had decided that the future of sports car racing lay in 3.5-liter naturally aspirated engines, essentially Formula One technology. The old Group C rules, which had allowed all sorts of creative engine configurations and made endurance racing one of the most technically diverse categories in motorsport, were being phased out. And that meant Mazda's rotary engine was about to be legislated out of existence, not next decade, not next season. This was the last year. 1991 would be the final time a rotary engine could compete at Le Mans under these rules. Now or never. Those words get thrown around a lot in sports. Here they were literally true. Making things considerably worse, the year before had been a disaster. Mazda showed up to Le Mans in 1990 with two brand-new 787 chassis and the latest version of their four-rotor R26B engine. Both new cars retired. One developed an oil leak. The other suffered an electrical failure that sparked a fire. The older 767B they had brought as a backup limped home in 20th place. Meanwhile, Mercedes won the World Championship for a second consecutive year. Jaguar won Le Mans. Toyota finished 6th. Nissan looked strong. And Mazda? Mazda went home to Hiroshima with nothing except the bitter knowledge that they had one final attempt left, and the clock was running out. So Mazda did what Mazda always does. They went back to the workshop, locked the door, and got obsessive about fixing every single thing that had gone wrong. The team behind this effort was Mazda Speed, the company's motorsport subsidiary. It had been founded back in 1967 by a man named Takayoshi Ohashi, who ran Mazda Auto Tokyo, one of the largest Mazda dealerships in the Japanese capital. Ohashi was a character, shrewd, politically cunning, blessed with a sharp sense of humor and an absolute refusal to accept defeat gracefully. He had first entered a car at Le Mans in 1974 and had kept coming back year after year for nearly 2 decades. 13 entries over 18 years. His best results were class victories, never an overall threat. The man simply did not quit. By 1991, Ohashi had assembled a genuinely international racing operation, far more sophisticated than most people gave him credit for. The chassis designer was Nigel Stroud, a Briton who had worked in Formula One engineering cars for March, Hesketh, and Team Lotus, before moving into endurance racing and making a name for himself by cleverly redesigning the Porsche 956 chassis for Richard Lloyd's privateer team. The team consultant for strategy and race management was Jackie Ickx, the Belgian who had won Le Mans 6 times, making him the most successful driver in the race's history at that point. Having Ickx on board was not merely about strategy, it was about credibility. When Jackie Ickx tells you your race plan is solid, people pay attention. The French organization Oreca handled logistics and European operations. Seasoned drivers like Pierre Dieudonné and Yojiro Terada brought years of accumulated knowledge. It was a small operation compared to the resources available at Mercedes or Jaguar. But every single person in it was operating at their absolute peak. The driver lineup for the number 55 car was its own remarkable story. Volker Weidler, a German who had tried to break into Formula One with the hopelessly uncompetitive Real team in 1989 and had failed to qualify for a single one of the 10 races he entered. Not one start. Bertrand Gachot, a Belgian-French driver who just weeks after Le Mans would end up in a London prison for spraying CS gas into the face of a taxi driver during a road rage incident. His empty seat at Jordan Grand Prix would be filled by a completely unknown 22-year-old German named Michael Schumacher. And then there was Johnny Herbert. Herbert is the emotional center of this entire story. In 1988, he was one of the brightest young talents in all of British motorsport. He had won the Formula Ford Festival in '85, caught Eddie Jordan's eye, and together they won the British Formula 3 Championship in 1987. James Hunt, the former world champion turned television commentator, called Herbert the next big thing on multiple broadcasts. His trajectory pointed straight at the top of Formula One. Then came August 21, 1988, a Formula 3000 race at Brands Hatch. Gregor Wojtek's car clipped Herbert's at Pilgrim's Drop launching him head-on into the barrier at enormous speed. He bounced across the track and hit the opposite wall. His feet and ankles were shattered, multiple fractures in both legs. At Queen Mary's Hospital, the surgeons debated amputating his left foot. His racing engineer, Trevor Foster, was standing in the room. Foster told the doctors in no uncertain terms that amputation was not going to happen. 7 months later, Herbert could barely walk without crutches. He lined up for his Formula One debut in Brazil with the Benetton team. His left ankle was, in his own words, the size of a melon. His right foot could barely press the brake pedal. He learned to let his damaged left foot simply flop loose in the bottom of the monocoque to absorb the jarring bumps. He qualified 10th, and he finished 4th. 3 years later, he was driving for Mazda at Le Mans. Now, the machine. The 787B was a significant evolution of the car that had failed the year before. Stroud redesigned the suspension geometry to accommodate larger 18-inch wheels. The wheelbase was extended by 25 millimeters for improved stability under braking. The bodywork was extensively reworked through wind tunnel testing at Mira for better engine cooling, more consistent aerodynamic downforce, and reduced drag on the long straights. Carbon ceramic brakes were fitted for the first time on any Mazda race car. The monocoque was constructed from carbon fiber and Kevlar, built in Derbyshire, England. And sitting in the middle of all of it, behind the driver, was the engine that mattered most. The R26B four rotors arranged in a line. 2.6 liters of total displacement, with each rotor chamber displacing 654 cubic centimeters. In qualifying trim, with nothing held back, it could produce approximately 900 horsepower at over 10,000 revolutions per minute. But the engineers made a calculated strategic decision that would prove critical. They restricted the redline to 9,000 revolutions per minute and limited race output to around 700 horsepower. They deliberately left 200 horsepower sitting on the shelf. Why would you do that? Because at Le Mans, the car that crosses the finish line first isn't the one that went fastest, it's the one that survived. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. The R26B's development list ran to over 80 individual improvements over the previous year's engine. That is not a minor revision. That is practically a ground-up rethink of everything, using the same basic architecture. Start with the intake system. Earlier versions of the four-rotor engine used telescopic intake runners that adjusted in discrete steps to optimize airflow at certain RPM bands. The idea was sound, but the steps created gaps in the torque curve where the engine would hesitate slightly before the next step engaged. For 1991, the entire system was redesigned to be continuously variable. The telescopic runners now slid smoothly from their longest to shortest configuration and back again, controlled in real time by the onboard engine computer based on RPM and throttle position. This was the first time a system like this had been used on any rotary engine. The result was remarkable. From 6,000 to 9,000 revolutions per minute, the R26B delivered at least 95% of its peak torque of 608 Newton-meters, constantly, without dips, without flat spots. In practical terms, it meant the drivers could put their foot down almost anywhere on the circuit and the car would respond with the same relentless pull. For a rotary engine, that borders on the impossible. Rotary engines are famous for making power exclusively at high revs and giving the driver almost nothing in the mid-range. The R26B rewrote that narrative entirely. The ignition system was equally clever. 3 spark plugs per rotor instead of the standard 2, making 12 plugs across the entire engine. The additional plug was positioned on the far trailing side of the combustion chamber, designed to ignite the air-fuel mixture before the squish effect could push unburned gases into the chamber's corners. This produced a more complete and more even combustion cycle. The benefit was twofold. Slightly more power, yes, but much more importantly, significantly better fuel economy. The engineering papers that Mazda published afterward showed clear, measurable improvements in both output and brake-specific fuel consumption directly attributable to the third spark plug. For an engine type that had always been criticized for guzzling fuel, this single change was transformative. Now, the apex seals. This is the part where Rotary skeptics always shake their heads because in any Wankel engine, the apex seals are the thin strips at each tip of the triangular rotor that press against the housing wall to maintain compression. They are the single component most responsible for the Rotary engine's reputation for unreliability. In production road cars, they wear out. They crack under thermal stress, they fail. The R26B addressed this head-on with two-piece seals fabricated from silicon nitride ceramic, paired with a proprietary additive that Mazda's engineers would only describe as improving heat conductivity. The rotors themselves were precision cast using the lost wax method to minimize rotating mass. Compression ratio 10:1. The rotor housings were coated with Kermit, a ceramic metal composite developed through extensive testing on reciprocating wear rigs, and the results showed dramatically less wear than conventional gas-soft nitrided cast iron. Every internal surface was built to survive 24 hours of sustained abuse. The complete engine weighed 180 kilograms, 396 pounds. It was just 39 inches long, for 700 reliable, race-proven horsepower. For comparison, the Mercedes 5.8, making similar power, weighed significantly more and occupied considerably more space in the chassis. Now for the politics, which may have mattered as much as the engineering. When FISA allowed the old Group C cars to race alongside the new 3.5-liter Formula at Le Mans, they imposed a penalty. Every piston engine Group C car would carry 100 kilograms of extra ballast. The Mercedes C11s, the Jaguar XJR12s, every Porsche 962 privateer entry, all of them gained 100 kilos. But Ohashi spotted something in the regulations. He argued successfully that the Mazda's rotary engine was not a large-capacity power plant. It displaced only 2.6 liters. FISA agreed. Nobody really thought Mazda posed a serious threat to the European teams, so no one fought it particularly hard. The 787B was cleared to race at 830 kilograms with no ballast. That made it 150 kilograms lighter than the lightest Porsche in the C2 class, and 170 kilos lighter than the Jaguars, which had weighed 900 kilograms the year before, but were now carrying a full 1,000. That weight difference was not trivial. It affected tire degradation, brake wear, fuel consumption per lap, and cornering speed. It was a systematic advantage across every single element of a 24-hour race. Race day, June 22, 1991. Circuit de la Sarthe, 38 cars on the starting grid, 250,000 spectators lining the roads and grandstands. The grid itself was absurd. FISA mandated that the top 10 positions be reserved for cars running the new 3.5-liter Formula, regardless of qualifying times. So the two Peugeot 905s started first and second, despite being only the third and eighth fastest cars in qualifying. Jean-Louis Schlesser's Sauber-Mercedes, which had set genuine pole position with a blinding 3 minutes and 31 seconds, was pushed back to the 6th row. The Mazdas started 19th, 23rd, and 30th. Before the race, the French television commentator would later note that nobody would have wagered a single yen on Mazda winning. 4 p.m. Saturday. The race began. Peugeot led immediately, their 905s fast and aggressive, eager to validate the new formula. The Mercedes systematically carved through the field. By 10 p.m., just 6 hours in, both Peugeots were out. Engine failure on one, gearbox on the other. The 3.5-liter technology was simply not mature enough for this kind of punishment. Mercedes now held first, second, and third. A silver fortress. The Schlesser, Mass, and Furte car led. Palmer, Dickens, and Thiem were second. Schumacher, Wendlinger, and Kreutz-Pointner were third. Schumacher, just 22 years old, was setting times that made experienced engineers look at their stopwatches twice. He would eventually carve 5 full seconds off the existing lap record, posting a 3:35 that stood as the benchmark. The Jaguars, all 4 of them, sat in the top 10. But Tom Walkinshaw had made a calculated gamble that was already looking questionable. He had bored out the V12 from 7 liters to 7.4 for more power. Combined with the extra 100 kilos of ballast, the cars were desperately heavy on fuel. The drivers were coasting into corners, shifting early, doing everything they could to stretch their allocation. And the number 55 Mazda, the one wearing that electric green and orange renowned livery that would become one of the most recognizable racing paint schemes in history, it had worked its way into the top 5 by nightfall, quietly, methodically, no drama, just clean, reliable laps. Through the night, Weidler, Gauchot, and Herbert rotated driving stints, each one keeping to a precise fuel economy target. Herbert later recalled the surreal experience of driving through darkness at enormous speed, watching trackside spectators asleep in their camping chairs, momentarily illuminated by the exhaust flame as he downshifted through the Indianapolis corner. The R26B produced a noise unlike anything else on the circuit, a sustained, high-pitched wail that people compared to a MotoGP motorcycle or a V12 Formula One car. Around certain sections, marshals reportedly warned spectators to cover their ears. Weidler, sealed inside the cockpit, chose to remove his earplugs so he could hear the Rotary's full voice more clearly. Against the advice of the team, against basic common sense, it would be the decision that ended his career. By midnight, Mercedes led comfortably. Then, things crumbled. Around 2 a.m., Palmer's C11 pitted with severe handling issues caused by underbody damage. 35 minutes lost. At 4:50 a.m., Schumacher's car came in with a damaged gearbox. The Mazda moved to second. At 7:15 a.m., the second Mercedes stopped dead. Water pump drive belt failure, overheated engine, terminal. 1 Mercedes remained, leading by 3 laps. The Jaguars couldn't charge because of their fuel situation. The Mazda sat patiently in second, turning laps. For 5 more hours, Schlesser's crew held on. Then, at 12:50 p.m., with just over 3 hours left, it happened. The last Mercedes overheated. Another water pump belt. Same failure that had killed the other car. The mechanics worked frantically. It was over. The Mazda 787B led the 24 hours of Le Mans. Herbert drove the final 2-hour stint. Pure concentration. The Jaguars couldn't close. The privateers were too far back. The only thing that could stop Mazda now was itself. It did not stop. In 24 hours of racing, the car required nothing beyond fuel, tires, 1 headlamp bulb, and a precautionary wheel bearing change. That is all. 4 p.m. Sunday, June 23rd, 362 laps, 4,923 kilometers, average speed 205 kilometers per hour, 2 laps ahead of the nearest Jaguar. Herbert was so dehydrated that he collapsed getting out of the car and had to be carried to the medical center. He missed the podium ceremony entirely. Weidler and Gauchot stood up there without him. After the race, Mazda's engineers disassembled the R26B in front of the press. After over 3,000 racing miles, the ceramic apex seals showed just 20 microns of wear, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the acceptable upper limit. The engine had lost approximately 2% of its power over the entire race. The car still had 30 liters of fuel remaining from its 2,550-liter allocation. The engine, in the engineer's own assessment, looked nearly new. It could have raced around the clock a second time. The Rotary was banned from Le Mans the following year. Mazda returned in '92 with a conventional engine and achieved nothing. They did not enter the year after. The R26B's final act on the world stage was its greatest. There was no encore. The winning car, Chassis 002, was immediately retired from competition. It lives at Mazda headquarters in Hiroshima, maintained in full running order. When it makes rare demonstration appearances at Goodwood or Le Mans centenary celebrations, sometimes with Herbert himself behind the wheel, it still stops people in their tracks. The sound reaches you before the car does. Herbert went on to race 12 seasons in Formula One, winning 3 Grand Prix. Gauchot drove for Jordan that summer before his prison sentence for the taxi driver assault. His empty seat at the Belgian Grand Prix was given to Michael Schumacher, launching the career of the most successful driver in the history of Formula One. A strange chain of events tied back to a rotary engine screaming through the French night. And Weidler, the German who pulled out his earplugs to savor the sound of the R26B? The tinnitus came first, then the balance problems. They hit the following year while he was leading the Japanese Formula 3000 Championship, winning at Suzuka and Sugo. He had to stop racing, retired at 30 years old. He went home to Weinheim, Germany, and took over his family's building cleaning business. He recommended a young driver named Heinz Harald Frentzen as his replacement. His greatest achievement in motorsport had taken from him the ability to continue doing it. Japanese television networks broke into their regular programming to show the final hours. In a country where Toyota and Nissan had invested far greater sums chasing this same victory, the fact that it was Mazda from Hiroshima, the smallest of the three, that got there first carried enormous cultural weight. It was not the biggest company, not the richest. It was the most persistent. As of 2026, the 787B remains the only car powered by a non-reciprocating piston engine to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans. No other rotary, no turbine, nothing. Toyota did not secure their own Japanese manufacturer victory until 27 years later, in 2018, running a hybrid prototype with minimal opposition. Mazda still carries traces of rotary DNA in its current lineup. The MX-30 uses a small single-rotor Wankel as a range extender for its electric motor. It is quiet, efficient, not screaming at 9,000 revolutions per minute down the Mulsanne Straight. But the idea lives on, finding new applications, refusing to be written off completely. Behind an access panel on the winning car, there is a handwritten note, dated August 1991, signed by a small group of the original Mazda Speed engineers, a private message hidden inside the machine they built together from the people who made it possible. What it says, Mazda has never publicly disclosed. Some things stay between the builders and what they built. The car nobody expected to win, the engine the world had written off. The team that kept coming back for 17 years until they finally, on the last possible attempt, got it right. Sometimes the approach that everyone else abandoned turns out to be the correct one. You just have to be stubborn enough to find out. And there you have it. The Mazda 787B. An engine the size of a suitcase that outlasted everything Mercedes and Jaguar threw at Le Mans. If you have heard one of these run in person, you know exactly why Weidler took his earplugs out. If you have not, look it up. Your ears will either thank you or they will not. Ask Volker Weidler. Subscribe if you want more of these. We will be back soon.